Hello all, this is your Professor Ian. Today I'm going to be talking about the Iliad. So let me just start this up. Uh, there we go, from the beginning. So we're talking about the Iliad for this part of the course. So I'm going to talk about the Trojan War. Specifically, I'm going to talk about what the Iliad is, what the Iliad is about, and what the Iliad is not about. Because oftentimes we come into the Iliad, if you haven't read it before, you're in for a treat, first of all. But if you haven't read it before, you're probably going to have some knowledge of the Trojan War and Achilles and what happened during that. You know, the Trojan horse, Achilles being shot in the heel and dying, right? His weak point, things like this. You're going to be surprised by some of the things that are and are not in the actual Iliad written by Homer. So, what is the Iliad? Well, it's the most popular narrative in Greek culture. It was this treasured tale of heroism. Altogether, it's over 15,000 lines of poetry was written as a poem. Of course, it has oral roots rather than written roots. It was first performed at ceremonies and for entertainment and such long before it was written down. So the version that we have is it exactly what Homer would have recited at competitions and such? Probably not. Is it close? Probably. Has it gone through changes? Probably. But it's probably pretty close. We've divided it into 24 books that happened in around the third century BCE. So after the Roman Empire or the birth of Christ or whatnot. So scholars divided into 24 books just for ease of talking about it. It's attributed to the poet named Homer, but we don't really know for sure whether this is all his work. It all holds together. The style, most scholars agree that the style holds together as one consistent document. It's all on the same theme. There's no wildly divergent parts. It's not like Hesiod's Works and Days, which really does feel like two very different things smashed together. Rather, the Iliad does feel like one coherent whole. But again, is this all the original Homer's words? Probably not. But it is, this unique take on the Trojan War, because as we're going to see, it's not really about the Trojan War so much as about Achilles, right? So it is a unique take on that. It does seem to be the product of one creative mind, but who can say for sure? We do know that it has roots in oral poetry, right? Specifically, dactylic hexameter. It's a mouthful, right? It's not something we often talk about. It's not something we use a lot in English poetry, especially contemporary English poetry. One question you're going to have as you're reading through, you're going to run across some of these terms: the Achaeans, the Danaans, and the Argives. This just means Greeks. This just means the Greek people. They didn't call themselves the Greeks at the time, so they had all these different names for themselves. You're going to see all these, and this just means the Greek soldiers, right? You're also going to see there's a lot of epitaphs, so like far-darting Apollo and things like this, a kind of phrase used before the name of a hero or a god to give them give the listener or the reader an idea of their fame and their reputation and their skills. This is a big feature of Greek oral poetry. They use these epitaphs a lot. You can imagine if you're reciting this poem, there's over 15,000 lines. You need a way to kind of like build a rhythm and remember things. And by having these familiar phrasings right before names, it helps for the memory and for the flow of the poetry. So that's, where these come from. And sometimes they seem to shift for no reason, right? Zeus is known by different things: storm, mountain god, counselor, right? Sometimes they seem to be relevant to the action. Sometimes they just seem to be poetic flourishes. So don't be bothered by that. These are some of the poetry, the oral roots of this epic. On that note, it is epic poetry. Epic poetry is a lengthy narrative poem, so it's telling a story, right? Not every poem tells a story. A lot of poems look at an image, dissect an idea, things like this, get into a feeling. But epic poetry is definitely narrative, telling a story, right? There's beginning, middle, end, crisis, climax to the story. Epic poetry usually involves a time beyond living memory. And remember, we looked at those archaeological ages that we used to talk about the Greek, ancient Greek society. So this was, people look at the sack of Troy as being part of the Mycenaean age, right? So that kind of the height of the empire of ancient Greece before the Dark Ages, before the Archaic and the Classic Ages, so before the written records become widespread and popular. Before that era, there was, these large battles, and they think that the sacking of Troy happened at that time. They found archaeological remains of places they think are the city of Troy. It's interesting, and it changes. They keep finding new evidence and such. There's no conclusive evidence last I looked. So anyways, lengthy narrative poem happened in the bygone age of heroes, focuses on gods and supernatural forces that gave shape to the moral universe, right? And that's really what's happening a lot in this poem. Is it's a poem about heroic values and the interaction between gods and humans and how that's decided, right? Some other examples: Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad, Odyssey. We're going to get into the Odyssey next week. The Aeneid. This is the big Roman epic. A lot of fun. Beowulf and Paradise Lost is the most modern one I have listed here. Epics aren't as popular these days because they take a kind of sincerity and believing in heroism that I think is lost in our culture a little bit. You might think about the epic natures of superhero films. I think, with the Avengers series of movies, the whole Marvel cinematic universe, they've really kind of built up to an epic kind of bombast in some ways. But anyways, this was more popular in bygone eras. They feature epic heroes, right? So these are you're going to read about these giant battles and the feats that they're capable of, right? The heroes in this book are basically superhuman, right? They're not of ordinary men, and that's part of the grandeur of these stories, right? These are heroes that are long dead. They can't exist in our world anymore because men aren't like that anymore. Humans aren't like that anymore, right? This is a time of almost supernatural heroes. And, so many of the heroes in the Iliad are descended from gods or are helped by the gods and such, right? So there is a supernatural element. You're also going to find a lot of epic catalogs. We're not reading from book 2, but book 2 is probably the most famous epic catalog in the Iliad. It's the catalog of boats. There's pages and pages, lines, hundreds of lines of poetry devoted to listing the different people who came to fight in Troy and listing, their leaders. And, a lot of these people, looking through these names, they don't actually even show up in the Iliad except for this catalog. They're these great generals, these great heroes from these different parts that they're great leaders, but they're minor compared to our main cast of people, Menelaus and Agamemnon and Achilles, right? But it goes to support just the scale of this battle, right? The greatest kings from all across Greece came in their greatest boats with all their soldiers, and these epic catalogs are just meant to reinforce that. They're super boring to read for contemporary readers because do you recognize any of those names? I don't recognize any of those names. Well, Thebes and a couple of places, but most of these heroes are just minor compared to the figures that we're used to hearing about. So it's very repetitive and boring reading for contemporary readers, but it is meant to emphasize the sheer grandeur and scale of this battle. This isn't just a couple of heroes going out to get revenge. This is a whole every hero you can imagine is mobilized in this battle and invested. Also in this poem, you're going to see a lot of epic similes, they're called. So a simile is the comparison using like or as, of course. An epic simile is a comparison between two things using like or as, but it's elaborate in great detail, and it's meant to really pump up the grandeur of the person or the thing being compared. There are metaphors, but there's a lot of really blatant epic similes in the Iliad, more so than subtle metaphors. So here's what I mean. Here's an example. So it's from book 4. Then, O Menelaus, the blessed gods, the immortals, forgot thee not. And before all the daughters of Zeus, she that driveth the spoil, who took her stand before thee and warded off the stinging arrow. And that's Athena. She swept it just aside from the flesh, even as, right? So comparison. So Athena is saving Menelaus. Menelaus is one of the commanders of the Greek forces. He's the one whose wife was stolen by Paris, right? He's married to Helen. So he's basically, the cause of the war, right? He's one of the big figures. So anyways, he's about to be shot by an arrow. Athena swept it aside just from the flesh, even as a mother sweepeth a fly from her child when he lieth in sweet slumber, and of herself she guided it where the golden clasps of the bell were fastened, the corselet overlapped, right? So it's not just a simile, it's a very extended, grand kind of simile, right? And we see another one here. We see this throughout the book. These are used to really pump up the grandeur of what's happening. Okay, so moving on to what the Iliad is about, some important terms. Let me just talk about some of these. We talked about Kleos and Eidos last week, right? And I'm going to introduce Aristia and Xenia right now. So Kleos, remember that's the glory a hero receives after death when he or she is remembered. And Eidos is the flip side of that, the shame that comes with failure, which can also be remembered after death. So a warrior, right, a Greek hero wants Kleos, wants to avoid at all costs Eidos. So I'm going to introduce two other terms, Aristia, and this is the bravery of a warrior expressed through individual triumph, right? So for Greek heroes, it's not just enough to win in a battle, you have to win individual glory through individual battle. It's kind of like I've read about some native tribes, and they would count coup on their enemy, and that would involve, individually running up to one of their warriors and like grabbing them or cutting some hair off or something like that, getting like a trophy to show that you could go up and have that individual moment of bravery. And I've read about this in a lot of other cultures too. The Greeks had this term for it called aristia, which was this individual glory. So this is what you're going to see in the book, right? There are descriptions of battle scenes between the armies, but then the narrator, Homer, will really emphasize these individual struggles between great warriors, because that's really what you want to see in an epic poem like this. You want to see the exploits of great warriors. And, this is the same in other epics. If you've read Beowulf, Beowulf is very much a hero in the mold of Achilles, right? He brags about his individual exploits. It's all about him fighting Grendel and Grendel's mother. It's not really about, a combined effort of soldiers to defeat an enemy, right? That's not really what's important. Instead, this individual glory. The other thing I want to talk about was Xenia. This is another Greek value, and this means guest friendship. So being hospitable was super important to the Greeks. There were, they had rules that dictated the proper rules and rituals for both guests and hosts. And you might think, oh, what does that have to do with the Iliad? But you're going to be surprised at how much this plays into the Iliad, even into the very genesis of the war, right? The Trojan War has to do with Paris stealing Helen from Menelaus, right? And he is welcomed. He's there in Sparta visiting Menelaus and Agamemnon as part of like a diplomatic mission, right? They're not enemies, and he's there. He's been welcomed in. He's being showed the Xenia, right? He's welcomed in as a guest and a friend. And he's, they treat him like a great visitor, and he ends up breaking those rules by absconding with Helen, right? So he's broken these very central values in Greek culture, right? And this causes his father Priam and a lot of the other Trojans a lot of grief, because they have to stand up for Paris because he's one of theirs, but at the same time he's clearly broken the rules, right? We're going to see other moments where Xenia comes in play. I've given you a book where Agamemnon has sent his envoy to convince Achilles to go back to fighting, and Achilles welcomes these people in and treats them well, as dictated by the laws of Xenia. And it's an interesting scene. You might wonder, well, why is Achilles like pouring them wine and cutting them food? He doesn't like them. He's not going to go back and fight, but he has to treat them well as a guest in his tent. So that's it for now. I'm going to have part 2 of this where I talk about some of the background of the Iliad.